What's up everybody, and today I'm going to be discussing a semi-different topic. The topic for today is the timeline of the Pokémon games. As we all know, Nintendo mostly values gameplay over the actual story and plot of their games, so sometimes when you try to piece together a timeline, it can get rather messy and convoluted, such as the Zelda one. The timeline of the Pokémon games is no exception. Remakes and sequels can make it somewhat confusing, so hold on for one wild ride as I dissect exactly when the games happen. A quick side note, I won't be going in depth on all of the in-universe stuff that happens. This is just a general video for what the timeline of the games is. Maybe some other day I'll go in and cover a timeline for all of the small events that happen, but for right now this is just a basic overview. Alrighty, let's kick this thing off at the beginning. First we have to start with the original games. Pokémon Red and Green. So we've really lucked out with these games. Naturally, the first created come at the beginning of the timeline. Not really a shocker there. As we all know, Pokemon games usually have a third version, and this all started with Pokemon Yellow. An interesting thing about third versions though, is that they essentially overwrite the previous games. Essentially, the story and events in Yellow are now the main source of story canon, rather than what happened in Red, Green, and Blue. There wasn't any changes to the story though, so we can really just keep these games all together. Let's fast forward to the next generation, which contains the Pokemon games Gold, Silver, and Crystal. These games were originally intended to be a direct sequel to the first generation, so the timeline is super clear. It takes place 3 years after the events of Generation 1. Various people in Rocket grunts in the game confirmed that Team Rocket was beaten 3 years ago by a kid. As was the case with Yellow, Crystal overrides any story stuff with its new enhanced story. Unfortunately, this is where the easy timeline stuff ends. We're coming up on Generation 3, mainly Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Game Freak wanted to cut ties with the previous games. Home was a brand new region that didn't have any link to previous games or generations. At the time, everyone just figured that it came after Gold, Silver, and Crystal. You know, like a normal timeline. To truly find out where Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald go, we have to look at the other games in Generation 3, which were the Red and Green remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green. With remakes finally coming into play, we have to know something very important about them. They completely overwrite the games that they are remaking. For example, with Fire Red and Leaf Green in play, the original games, Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow, are completely off of the timeline in favor of the updated remakes. Fire Red and Leaf Green still retain their position at the start of the timeline, but now they're joined by the other Generation 3 games. As seen in Fire Red and Leaf Green, on the Sevi Islands, you can do a side quest that allows you to trade with Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. To do it, you need to essentially link the two PC systems of the regions. If you can link between the two regions and trade openly with them, then it's safe to say that these games happen parallel to each other. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green happen at the same time as Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum have just come into play. We would naturally assume that they would be at the end of the timeline. Since this is a Pokemon timeline, that is astonishingly the wrong place to put them. To place when these games happen, we need the help of remakes again. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver are remakes of Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and as with Fire Red and Leaf Green, they replace the games that they are remaking on the timeline. In Heart Gold, Soul Silver, you are able to openly trade with Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, along with seeing several people from either region in the opposite region. This more than confirms that Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum happens at the same time as Heart Gold and Soul Silver, whose timeline spot is still undisturbed. Moving on to Generation 5, we get a brand new take on the series. New region, new Pokemon, new characters. One question remains though. Where does this fit into the timeline at? We know that Black and White come after all other games. There are various characters throughout the game who talk about the events that happened in previous games, such as Team Aqua and Magma, or even the Lake of Rage in Johto. Unfortunately, we don't know how long it was after the Generation 4 games that Black and White occurred. I'd estimate it at about 2 to 5 years, but nobody really knows. Black 2 and White 2 are very easy to place, as it's outright stated that they come 2 years after the original Black and White. So with Gen 5 finally placed, let's take a look at Generation 6. So we don't have much to look at in terms of actual canon to find out when these take place, but luckily we do have another resource. Toshinobu Matsumiya, the lead scenario director of Pokémon, took to Twitter and confirmed the timeline. Surprisingly, it's spot on to what I've described. There is a small bit of new information though, and that he says that Pokemon X and Y actually happen at the same time as Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. Lucky for us, that solved most of the mysteries of the timeline. Except, there is one game that is unaccounted for. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Pokemon Alpha Sapphire. Going back to what Toshinobu Matsumiya said on Twitter, he confirmed that Ruby and Sapphire happened at the same time as Fire Red and Leaf Green. Now, this tweet was made on the same day that Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were announced. And that leaves a really big mystery for us. Does this tweet apply to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, or is he just talking about the original games? Assuming that he's talking about Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, here is what the completed timeline would look like. Although to be honest, this isn't where I would put the games. I think it's much more likely that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire overwrite the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald and actually jump up to where Generation 6 is. It would make much more sense, considering that there are Gen 6 Pokemon in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, along with a brand new plot regarding Mega Evolution, which was exclusive to X and Y along with Gen 6 games. With that said, here's my updated timeline with how I think that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire will be placed. Although until we get flat out confirmation, I think that this timeline could go either way. And with that, we've covered all of the mainline games currently released. It definitely makes a little more sense, and it's not quite as complicated as some might believe. There are some small, weird things here and there, but it's overall a pretty solid timeline once you break it down. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.